Hello, my name is Rebecca Gutierrez, and I will be presenting sovereignty versus humanitarian intervention while exploring philosophical and legal perspectives. Sovereignty is a political concept referring to a dominant power or supreme authority. State sovereignty is the authority of a state to govern itself, create laws, and conduct affairs without external interference. Humanitarian intervention is the use of military force by one or more states to protect civilians in another state from severe human rights abuse or humanitarian crises. Sovereignty versus humanitarian intervention is not only highly relevant as it touches on various philosophical, legal, and moral issues in international law, but both are highly contested concepts and continuously debated. Something you should ask yourself while I give this presentation is, should the sovereignty of a state be respected even when human rights are at stake? The tensions between human rights, the idea that all people, regardless of nationality, religion, gender, or any other factor, should be granted certain protections, and state sovereignty, the idea that the nation state has authority and independence, are too complex to be thoroughly concluded. The central tension arises when the two principles collide. Intervening to protect human rights may be seen as an overreach that violates a state's sovereignty, undoubtedly disrupting its political stability and autonomy. Conversely, failing to intervene leads to accusations of complicity in human rights abuse, suggesting that respecting sovereignty above all else can ignore the moral responsibility to prevent suffering. The tension between the principles is a profound plight one that demands careful consideration of legal frameworks, ethical theories, and the practical outcomes of interventions. Each perspective will offer insight, yet none will provide a simple answer, shining the light on the complicated balance between justice and autonomy in international relations. Its importance lies in addressing a core issue in international relations law, the balancing rights of the nations to self-govern with the responsibility to protect individuals from harm. It reveals the complexities of upholding justice while maintaining global stability. It calls for subtle frameworks that respond to human rights abuse without undermining the sovereignty that is indispensable to peaceful international relations. The philosophical frameworks include the natural law theory, legal positivism, social contract theory, utilitarianism, critical legal theories, and feminist legal theory. Now, in detail. The natural law theory argues that there are universal moral principles inherent to human nature. These principles that exist independently of any specific legal system or government. They're often seen as self-evident truths, such as the right to life, freedom from oppression, and the respect for an individual's dignity. In the context of sovereignty versus humanitarian intervention, the natural law theory is interpreted as promoting a moral duty to protect these universal rights, even if by doing so it involves crossing national borders. If a state fails to uphold or actively violates these rights, proponents of natural law argue that other states can be morally justified and possibly obligated to intervene to protect individuals from harm. The justification rests on the belief that moral principles exceed national boundaries, and protecting human dignity is the fundamental responsibility that overrides non-interference. The implementation of the natural law theory is if and when a government either will or cannot protect its citizens from human rights abuse, natural law suggests that other nations or international bodies are morally compelled to intervene. The challenge to state sovereignty is, since natural law does not prioritize a state's authority over universal moral obligations, it challenges sovereignty by implying that protecting human rights is a much higher priority than respecting a government's autonomy. Essentially, the natural law theory frames human rights as a non-negotiable moral imperative that takes precedence over political considerations of sovereignty, and emphasizes that at a fundamental level, humanity has a collective responsibility to ensure that these rights are respected globally. Legal positivism. It emphasizes the importance of adhering to established laws by legitimate authorities. In legal positivism, a law's validity is based on its creation and recognition within a specific legal system, not on moral or ethical considerations. In a legal positivist perspective, intervention without a clear legal basis is both ethically questionable as well as a direct violation of international law and state sovereignty. Without legal authorization, a United Nations resolution, or a formal treaty, humanitarian intervention will be seen as a violation of international law and an infringement on the sovereign rights of a state to manage its own affairs. This philosophical view values the stability and the integrity of international law. It argues that unauthorized intervention not only violates sovereignty but also risks undermining the legal order that supports peaceful international relations. Lawful intervention should be strictly regulated through formal international frameworks, ensuring that sovereignty and legal authority are respected. The social contract theory. It emphasizes the legitimacy of a state's power is not absolute. In the context of humanitarian intervention, the social contract theory provides a moral justification for intervening in situations where human rights abuses indicate a breach of the social contract theory. When a government fails to protect citizens or actively violates their rights, the social contract theory suggests that its legitimacy is undermined, potentially justifying international intervention. The key points of the social contract theory include the widespread human rights violations, the neglect of basic needs, acts of aggression against citizens, and intervention as a response for protecting citizens' rights and the reestablishing of a legitimate government. The theory can morally justify humanitarian intervention as a means to protect the population and ideally aiding the establishment of government that respects the social contract. Nonetheless, the challenges of applying this perspective in practice, such as geographical interest, risks of unintended consequences, and the need for post-intervention stability, shines the light on the need for cautious, well-considered approaches when contemplating intervention in real-world context. Utilitarianism. It is a moral theory that focuses on promoting the greatest overall happiness or well-being for the greatest number of people. Its core principle is the greatest happiness principle. It is that actions are right as long as they tend to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. It encourages a cost-benefit analysis of actions where the decision is based on the collection of positive and negative effects on the individuals involved. In international relations, this theory can be applied to humanitarian intervention, specifically when deciding whether or not to intervene in a country's internal affairs for the sake of protecting human rights. In the context of humanitarian intervention, utilitarianism would weigh the potential benefits and harms of intervention, considering the short-term and the long-term consequences for the affected population, the intervening countries, and the international community. Key considerations is the benefits of intervention, harms of intervention, and the long-term considerations. Now, the critical legal studies emphasizes the idea that law is not neutral, but it is instead a tool that reinforces power dynamics and social inequalities. Key principles of the critical legal studies include that law is political, law reinforces inequality, the interdependency of law, and intersectionality and structural inequality. In critical legal studies, humanitarian intervention might be viewed with some skepticism, specifically when it is carried out by powerful states or coalitions. The critical legal studies theorists argue that interventions by powerful states, while frames as efforts to protect civilians, may be more about maintaining geopolitical control, promoting the interests of the intervening powers, and the imposing external norms on weaker states. Nonetheless, while the intention behind humanitarian intervention can stop human rights abuses, the critical legal critiques would focus on the multiple ways these interventions often serve the interests of political states, undermining the sovereignty and autonomy of the countries they appear to help. The feminist legal theory. The feminist legal theory emerges as a critical response to traditional legal thought, which often overlook the experiences and the needs of marginalized groups, especially women. It critiques how law has historically been structured to maintain patriarchal systems and gendered inequalities. It aims to reshape legal practices and institutions to be more inclusive, recognizing that the law does not affect all individuals equally, specifically those from oppressed social groups. Its core principles include gender empowerment, intersectionality, reproductive justice, and challenging patriarchal and the male gaze. With its focus on gender, power, and the experiences of marginalized groups, can provide a compelling justification for humanitarian intervention, especially when the intervention aligns with protecting vulnerable populations, such as women, children, and other marginalized groups who are disproportionately affected by conflict and violence. The feminist legal theory and humanitarian intervention focuses on vulnerable populations, gendered impact of armed conflicts, addressing intersectionality in humanitarian crises, challenging patriarchal structures through intervention. From this perspective, humanitarian intervention is justified when it serves to protect a vulnerable population, particularly women and children, from gender-based violence, exploitation, and other forms of harm during conflicts. The feminist legal theory, it supports interventions that seek to stop the immediate violence and promote long-term social change and gender equality. International legal frameworks, such as the United Nations Charter in 1945, is a foundational international document that governs relations between states with an emphasis on the principles of sovereignty and non-interference in the international affairs of states. Its key points include Article 2, the sovereign equality of states. This article emphasizes that all member states are equal under international law, affirming the principle of state sovereignty and non-interference. Article 2.4, prohibition of the use of force. This article prohibits the use of force in international relations except in the cases of self-defense or when authorized by the UN Security Council. Article 2.7, non-interference in domestic affairs. This article affirms that the United Nations cannot intervene in matters that are essentially within domestic jurisdiction of any state. The responsibility to protect, or R2P, is an international doctrine adopted by world leaders at the 2005 World Summit. R2P aims to provide a framework for humanitarian intervention, particularly in cases where a state is unable or unwilling to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Challenges and limitations of sovereignty, R2P, and legal frameworks. Respect for sovereignty. In the UN Charter, it upholds the principle of state sovereignty, making intervention in the sovereign state affairs a legally challenging proposition. Political and practical challenges of R2P is while R2P offers a framework for intervention, applying it has been inconsistent. The selective intervention is that R2P has been criticized for its selectivity in implementation. And lastly, humanitarian versus political motives. Interventions justified on humanitarian grounds may be complicated by underlying political motivations, including gaining control of resources, asserting geopolitical influence, or maintaining strategic alliance. Emerging global challenges. Emerging global challenges are reshaping the understanding of state sovereignty as they reveal the limitations of states acting alone. Addressing these issues may require setting a degree of international intervention or shared governance to protect both national and global interests. Balancing sovereignty with global responsibility could enable the world to respond effectively to these interconnected crises, moving toward a cooperative international order that prioritizes both respect for sovereignty and the protection of shared human interests. Case studies. The case studies involve Kosovo. The Kosovo intervention is a pivotal case in understanding the clash between state sovereignty and humanitarian intervention. It serves as a reminder of the legal, moral, and political complexities involved in balancing the protection of human rights with the principles of state sovereignty and international law. It presented the challenges in applying universal principles to real-world situations and the implications of these decisions for international relations, state power, and the global legal order. Syria. The Syrian war from 2011 to the present time demonstrates how principles of state sovereignty and humanitarian intervention are at odds when a government engages in systemic violations of human rights. Utilitarianism, social contract theory, and the critical legal studies provide important ethical and political perspectives on intervention in Syria, showing how the clash between sovereignty and humanitarian concerns continues to shape the course of the conflict and international responses. Nazi Germany. The intervention in Nazi Germany during World War II demonstrates a significant breach of the principle of sovereignty in favor of humanitarian intervention. The natural law theory also supported the moral condemnation of Nazi policies during World War II as the regime's actions blatantly violated universal human rights. Reactions to these violations including the Nuremberg trials and the creation of the UDHR defines how natural law principles guided the post-war efforts in establishing international standards for human rights protection. Ultimately, balancing sovereignty with the moral imperative to protect human rights remains a challenge in international law. Each theory, whether emphasizing universal rights, state consent, or the critique of power dynamics, offers valuable insights but also reveals the complexities and limitations in practice. As new global challenges emerge, like climate change and refugee crises, rethinking this balance may be essential to developing more effective and just responses on the world stage. The ongoing debate reflects the need for evolving frameworks that can better address human suffering while respecting the diversity and autonomy of nations. Thank you.